we go, equally important, to another topic and a very eminent speaker, and that is Professor Sheila Ronis, who is the chair and professor of the Department of Management at Walsh College. Now, that is in Virginia, yeah?
Michigan.
Oh, I thought you'd moved to Virginia.
I did, but I still work in
Michigan. Okay, right. So, I am corrected. This is in Michigan, and I have colleagues and friends in Michigan, but I know why she will have moved to Virginia, particularly at this time of year. So, she is an expert in management, also in scenario and foresight planning, and that is the subject of her talk, looking at this in terms of societal resilience. And of course, it's entitled Societal Resilience, Lessons from Herman Kahn, and I'm sure one of the first things she will say is, who is Herman? Do you know who Herman Kahn is? Maybe you should think of in some ways, that some people have said that he may be behind a certain Peter Sellers film. She will explain. Anyway, please give a warm welcome to Sheila Ronis. Thank you.
Sometimes I think Herman Kahn is channeling me, but we'll talk a little bit about Herman Kahn, but not a lot. All right, well, let me see if I have better luck with this. Well, thank you very much for those kind introductory remarks. I'm very honored to be here, and Jan and Tony, thank you for your kind invitation to share my efforts as the Vision Working Group leader for the congressionally mandated and funded Project on National Security Reform in the United States. We were tasked with making recommendations to improve the U.S. national security system. And using foresight methodologies, the Vision Working Group tested our assumptions and our project's recommendations. And I had the great privilege of chairing the Vision Working Group. My friends at the Pentagon say that the really important part of foresight is the process of opening our eyes and minds to things we ordinarily wouldn't consider, literally to think the unthinkable. And it's the ultimate learning and planning tool. But today, with all the work trying to design and implement learning organizations a la Peter Senge, the truth is that many organizations don't value learning or the knowledge it brings. Most of these organizations haven't developed processes to share and use new knowledge acquired. Foresight tools can assist in this process. I think that that's why I have found it so useful, because if senior leadership's willing to learn and use that knowledge, foresight tools can help them along. And this requires an attitude that there is a need for new knowledge, that we don't have all the answers. And sometimes that's very difficult for government leaders to accept. And it's what Senge's group calls getting out of knowing and into learning. And this is exactly where the Pentagon was right after World War II, when America believed it knew all the answers, and before we lost our first war in Korea, and then a second in Vietnam, and then one in Iraq, one in Afghanistan, and the one we're fighting against terrorists that we're struggling with around the world. The processes I began to work with evolved out of the end of World War II, when Congress asked Herman Kahn at the Rand Corporation in California to help sort through the myriad issues surrounding nuclear warfare. He developed a process to force decision makers who were in denial into thinking the unthinkable. What would really happen if nuclear war became a reality? This thinking ultimately led to the understanding that nuclear war and mutually assured destruction was insane. It meant nuclear annihilation, and there could be no winners in a nuclear war. I would say it was an important lesson to learn. Concurrent to the development of the RAND Corporation process in the late 40s and early 50s, the concept of general systems theory was also emerging. In this work, scientists began to view the world differently, not just using the tools of analysis, but also of synthesis, which put the pieces of a system together in order to understand the whole. This created a new way of looking at the world using a systems integration discipline, which puts pieces together to understand how their fit makes the whole work. Ultimately, this discipline evolved into systems thinking, systems engineering, and of course, systems science. At the same time as the development of these theories, there was an increasing awareness that general systems theory applied to all natural systems: physical, biological, ecological, economic, social, political, financial, organizational, and on and on. And this is the legacy of Herman Kahn. He helped to create the crucial lessons that enabled the world to emerge from the Cold War without nuclear warfare. And I think we need to continuously repeat this process. This morning, I'm going to describe the results of the project and how we're prototyping my working group's major recommendation, because when national security is at risk, society is at risk, and the outcomes can be catastrophic if we are unprepared. The Vision Working Group recommended the establishment of a center in its July 2010 report and scenarios to the U.S. Congress. Over a 5-year period of study, we determined that the United States President needs a place, a process, and set of capabilities to develop and test grand strategy and policy decisions of the nation, and particularly to support the national security system. In addition, the need for the nation to develop anticipatory governance, structures, and processes, a research effort led by Professor Leon Firth at George Washington University, reinforced and validated the findings of the Vision Working Group of the Project on National Security Reform. In the United States, the National Security Strategy is the closest published document that represents a comprehensive discussion of where the country's going and what it wants to accomplish. Published from the White House from time to time, it's neither sufficiently long-term nor a true strategy that links ends, ways, and means over time. It represents, at best, a list of aspirational goals by an administration. In a world of increasing complexity, the United States needs to develop long-term, whole-of-government thinking and planning. Other countries have established such a set of capabilities within the heart of their governments, places like Israel, Finland, the UK, and even here in Singapore. My journey began nearly 25 years ago when, as a strategic management consultant to the private sector, I had an opportunity to do some work with the U.S. Army War College. When I read the U.S. National Security Strategy for the first time, I assumed it was a subset of a larger national strategy, but I was wrong. That summer, I realized for the first time that the United States does not develop long-term whole-of-government grand strategies. Let me repeat that. The United States does not develop long-term whole-of-government grand strategies. That's a little scary, don't you think? For decades, the private sectors routinely used management tools like forecasting, scenario-based planning, strategic visioning, political and economic risk analysis, and many, many other tools. But the U.S. government, at least in a whole-of-government way, rarely, if ever, uses such tools across agencies, although obviously those tools are used in pockets within agencies or departments. The question is, what mechanisms should the U.S. government develop to improve the nation's ability to plan in a whole-of-government way for its future, to be better prepared for a future that's very different from its past? At the end of World War II, General Marshall said, "We're now concerned with the peace of the entire world, and the peace can only be maintained by the strong." But how does the United States remain strong? What does that even mean in a world of globalization? And how should the country define what national security is in such a complex and interdependent world? At PNSR, we took a systems approach to examining this series of questions. The group stepped out into the next larger system and the system beyond that to look across the entire mosaic at the elements and their interdependence and interactions to better understand the whole and its behavior. The study engaged in both analysis and synthesis and used foresight tools to assist in testing the creation of the new structures, policies, strategies, and processes necessary for a successful 21st century national security system, as outlined in Forging a New Shield, the overall study for Congress and the President in December of 2008. U.S. security is rooted in the successful integration of all major elements of national power: economic, diplomatic, military, informational, and so on. When done correctly, the vitality of the nation is ensured and the country's ability to encourage positive change throughout the globe is enhanced. The Project on National Security Reform proposed a modern apparatus to serve the nation's needs well into the 21st century to support the broad national security challenges and address the interagency mechanisms in the organizational space between the President of the United States and the cabinet-level agencies and departments. The Vision Working Group asked the question, what is the basis for rethinking the national security system, and how will success in the future be characterized? If what is and is not in the arena of national security, and if those questions are artificially or prematurely narrowed, it's likely that situations will be misread that can ultimately and negatively affect the nation. Not too many years ago, the challenges related to subprime mortgages, diseased birds, automobile emissions, and pilot training rosters were not typically the focus of national security. And today it's clear that they might well have been. The point is, no one can imagine or determine now with certainty what might affect the nation in the future. Threats can be assessed and prioritized based on considerations like urgency, impact, magnitude, mitigation options, and intention. Opportunities can be assessed and prioritized based on considerations like knowledge, expertise, probability of success, resources, long-term sustainability, proportionality, and intention. And based on this approach, national security can be considered any situation, condition, or entity that has the potential to enhance or degrade the viability and vitality of the nation, so that the national security system would be responsible for and measured by the viability and vitality of the nation, peaceful and positive development throughout the countries of every region, and cooperation and collaboration around the globe. The national security system needs to become a learning organization that can anticipate, adapt to, and successfully address the widest range of threats and opportunities. As a complex adaptive system, the future security system needs to possess certain inherent qualities that will be critical to success. It needs to share information and collaborate horizontally, accommodate unanticipated needs and partnerships, ensure agility in the face of uncertainty, incorporate ad hoc structures and processes, and of course, most importantly, maintain a long-term view. Because the U.S. national security system is a complex adaptive system, it's tough to separate geopolitical, social, technological, or economic phenomena. These elements interact as a system of systems. But I would argue in most instances, it's a complex system of complex systems. And that's the challenge facing our nation. but I would also propose that it's the challenge facing the world. One of the major issues is that we're always being asked to predict and control. But prediction assumes theories, and theories require assumption testing to learn. And the complexity sciences say that in complex systems, there are limits to what we can learn or know with any precision. Even in physics, we can predict with probabilities, but not with certainty. And the Heisenberg uncertainty principle tells us we're not always able to predict everything. If we know some things, we can't know other things. And I think such is the case in the systems that we're responsible for. I find it troubling that although scientists may understand these ideas, many of the policymakers we work for and the bureaucracies we serve are not populated with knowledgeable leaders on this subject. They want and expect us to predict and control the real-world complex systems we work in. And the physicist in me knows we cannot. And the sociologist in me knows we cannot. The management professor in me knows we cannot. And the policymaker in me knows we cannot. So what are we doing? I've stopped trying to explain the laws of thermodynamics and entropy, and I've started to simplify things to both policy and lawmakers. I don't try to explain that we can still be successful in developing tools and methodologies that can help us in being better prepared. Even if we can't predict or control with certainty, we can predict and control with probabilities. Now, that's a problem if you don't understand statistics. Working in the world of complex system, which is the real world of policy, requires planning and learning. And the more planning and learning we do, the more successful our capabilities in designing, developing, and ultimately improving the complex systems we need for the future. Because complex systems can be influenced if you understand the system well enough. More than 2,500 years ago, the ancient Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu said in his masterpiece, The Art of War, "If you know your enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will suffer a defeat. But if you know neither yourself nor the enemy, you will succumb in every battle." In today's global context, this quotation suggests that if a nation is in any kind of competition, it must be familiar with and develop knowledge of its competitors, as well as itself, if success is to be expected. Nations must actively be learning. How well have nations developed relationships with their partners and friends to ensure cooperation when there's a problem anywhere on the globe? No one's big enough or wealthy enough to cover the world in terms of knowledge or capabilities. Not today. Success can only be achieved with learning, planning, anticipating, and most importantly, collaborating. And that's a huge lesson for the United States. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower said, "Plans are worthless, but planning's everything." I think that the president was explaining that through the knowledge learned in planning processes, plans are more likely to be successful. And this is learning in the Sun Tzu sense. Complex systems within the national security community and broader society have interesting characteristics worth identifying and discussing. Probably the most important characteristic is that complex systems can't be controlled. At best, they can be influenced, and these systems can only be influenced if understood intimately. A White House center needs to be a learning organization to support whatever national security structure is in place in the United States. The Center for Complex and Strategic Decisions is being prototyped to learn, analyze, assess, and synthesize risk, foresight, and the development of grand strategy across the government. The center would anticipate potential futures. One of the Vision Working Group's findings included the need to synthesize all of government solution sets to complex system issues and problems, and sometimes all of society. The only successful way to do that is to be learning about the system issues. These enable the development of scenarios for planning and ultimately being able to develop grand strategies. We also found that the United States needs to systematically use these tools and processes to improve decision-making and create mechanisms for that to happen at the whole of government level. And in the case of the United States, that's at the level of the president, and that requires context and synthesis. It also requires breaking down the stovepipes of government so they can work together effectively. We offer these kinds of tools to our Secretary of State, Defense, Energy, Agriculture, to the Director of National Intelligence. Why not our president? So to illustrate the kinds of capabilities needed in the White House and to stress test our recommendations to the Congress before they were made, PNSR developed 9 scenarios and 3 timeframes. The methodology of a full foresight effort was used in the project. In addition to complementing and enhancing our findings, the visioning process resulted in detailed scenarios against which specific options generated by the project were assessed. The process we used to develop the scenarios began by determining the purpose and scope of the scenarios. Since the National Security Act of 1947, which is still on the books, even though amended, survived largely intact now for nearly 70 years, despite major social, technological, economic, environmental, and political changes, the Vision Working Group looked ahead about 50 years. The nation will face extraordinary changes in the next 50 years. All of us will. Most forecasters and technologists believe that the rate of change in the next decades will accelerate so rapidly, it'll be difficult to imagine. It's with this in mind that the Vision Working Group was asked to create scenarios that would mainly provoke discussion and debate within the project and hopefully lead to better, more resilient recommendations. It was our experience that putting people into stories of the future enabled them to test assumptions and better understand complexity, not only their thoughts, but also their feelings. We then began the development of a questionnaire to be given to experts representing some of the best minds, at least in our country. For that process, we enlisted the assistance of experts in many fields, including a cross-section of the sciences and engineering, and in particular, the national academies in the United States. They sponsored a workshop that developed the survey instrument and questionnaire used to solicit the input of experts across the entire spectrum of human inquiry and science. The Vision Working Group, with input from the national academies, then created a list of experts to receive the questionnaire in many disciplines across the sciences, engineering, arts, futurists, fields too numerous to mention. The experts' viewpoints would be critical to the successful development of scenarios that would be based on their projections of the future. The questionnaire was sent to over 1,500 experts who were queried via email about the future of their disciplines. We were really hoping we could get 20 people to really participate. And it was hoped that, 2 to 3% of the population would return their opinions regarding the future, but 133 people responded, and that was a 9% response, so we were very pleased. And the responses represented a full spectrum of disciplines, and this was a questionnaire that many people spent well more than a couple hours on, so we thought we did well. The experts' insights on future trends and milestones were aggregated, analyzed, and synthesized to better understand the ways that the future could unfold. The trends identified by the experts were then woven into the scenarios representing the 3 time horizons, 2020, 2040, and 2060. Before the scenarios could be used to stress test the recommendations of the project, the Vision Working Group asked the commandants of our 3 major schools at the National Defense University to choose selected faculty who taught in the national security curriculum of each school to read the scenarios. We then stress tested with the national security faculty those scenarios at the National War College, the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and the Joint Forces Staff College. And based on the feedback of the faculty, the scenarios were finalized. The 5 major solution sets of the project were then stress tested by the working group leaders using the finalized scenarios. Now, as a caveat, the scenarios were intentionally designed to stress the working group's recommendations from lots of different angles, literally to the breaking point of the system, and that was the plan. The scenarios should never be viewed as predictions, but rather glimpses into plausible alternative futures. And they were intentionally inconsistent, they were oft-times bleak, all in the interest of provoking a wider range of conversation and learning. And later, I'm actually going to share a short film of one of them. For each scenario, 5 general questions were used in testing the solution sets. We asked, what are the stressors in the scenario? How well was the system able to anticipate scenario problems? And if the system was not able to prevent or remove the threat, how well was the system able to recover and react? And how well did the system function as a whole, specifically the structures and processes? We really were testing the resiliency of our system. Each scenario was then followed by specific discussion questions to ponder. And they were many. 3 general questions, though, were mainly used. We basically started with, how will the recommendations function in the scenario? Are there problems or solutions identified that we haven't addressed? But most importantly, if this future isn't desirable, what choices should we be making today to avoid it? And what is the impact of that to our policies? As the working group leaders worked through the scenarios, it was clear that each solution set performed differently in the different scenarios. And of course, that was what we were trying to do. Strengths and weaknesses of the solution sets gradually emerged. Now, let me share some of these with you. The 2020 scenarios included Red Death, in which the country is struggling to get back on its feet after a major biological attack, and witness a debate about the future role of the U.S. government, both at home and abroad. Societal and governmental infrastructure breaks down completely as more than 2 billion people on the planet are left dead or dying in this disturbing scenario, and more on this later. The People's War, in which the United States faces global asymmetric warfare against a nuclear-armed great power. The entire federal government's caught up in the conundrum of how to respond to anonymous attacks at home and abroad while avoiding an escalation to nuclear war with China. A grand strategy in which the utility of an integrated grand strategy development capability is explored for smoothing the transition from one presidential administration to another, which of course is the time when the United States is most vulnerable. The 2040 scenarios included a new economy in which the United States faces its worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The crisis is a perfect storm of the unintended consequences of new technologies, policies, court decisions, and popular expectations. An army of one, in which the intersection of unmanned robotic warfare and on-the-ground assisted diplomacy was explored. This scenario depends upon the continuation of current trends in robotics and sensors technology, as well as a public policy choice to enable greater real-time interaction between the military and diplomatic arms of the U.S. government. Who holds the high ground in which major competitive changes in the Earth-Moon system are envisioned from the perspective of a traditional interagency space working group. A Brave New World, in which a plan is examined to apply proven neuroscience, psychiatric, and medical techniques to the control of pathological behaviors in a world of readily accessible weapons of mass destruction and genetic engineering. The 2060 scenarios included a warm reception in which the challenge of developing international consensus for action on the issue of global climate change and the possibility of unintended consequences is finally focused. And it's a small world in which the implications of a very different future are explored, wherein the small molecular scale machines or nanobots have become truly ubiquitous. And finally, the possibility of a technological singularity by 2060 was noted, when robots will be smarter than human beings. And of course, how this will affect life on Earth, I think, is really unknown. The scenarios demonstrated that the 5 major findings of the Project on National Security Reform significantly improved system performance. And we were very pleased that it came out that way, because it wasn't clear that it would, but it did. But in addition to the project, I had a Fulbright here in Singapore in 2012 that included studying the Strategic Policy Office in the Office of the Prime Minister of Singapore, where many lessons were learned that will assist in the establishment of the U.S. Center. Peter Ho, our speaker yesterday, and the architect of Singapore's foresight system and process, has said there are 4 major roles for their Center for Strategic Futures, all of which should be represented in the U.S. Center's set of capabilities. Their challenge conformist thinking by building global networks and partnerships with academia, think tanks, and global thought leaders through conferences and projects. Identify emergent risks by creating risk maps and communicating emerging issues to decision makers. Calibrate strategic thinking processes by using scenario planning and risk assessment to develop policy and new capabilities. Cultivate capabilities, instincts, and habits by using systems and strategic frameworks and mindsets to deal with uncertainty, disruptive shocks, and whole-of-government approaches regularly. This set collectively, the set of capabilities and mindsets, represents a strategic capability for Singapore that would certainly enhance the capabilities within the Executive Office of the President of the United States, if we could adopt them. The scenarios used in PNSR represent the kind of systems thinking and strategic approaches that the United States needs today, the kind of thinking that should be infused in a U.S. White House. So to prototype the center needed in the White House, we established the Center for Complex and Strategic Decisions. Our vision is to use the application of advanced systems approaches to ameliorating complex problems and improving policy and strategy making for the U.S. government. Our mission is to provide this capability through the systems-level integration of foresight and strategic leadership models with high-powered complexity science and decision technologies. And this is the truest legacy of Herman Kahn. The Center for Complex and Strategic Decisions has many partners to enable the kinds of analysis required. Our largest partnership is with Argonne National Laboratory. It has a set of processes and capabilities that enable the development and use of forward-looking global contexts. The sophisticated tool sets of Argonne National Labs is a major part of the creation of the center because of their unique capabilities. And maneuvering within the complexity of today's world requires strategic thinkers who have the ability to understand nonlinear and unintended consequences of their policies and decisions. We've described this phenomenon as the West playing chess while the East is playing Wei Qi or Go, and then both sides wondering why they are not making progress in building their relationships because their mental models are so vastly different, and they do not know one another in the Sun Tzu sense. The center provides a rigorous framework to analyze, synthesize, test assumptions and solution sets, and integrate the elements of national power to provide contexts to support long-term strategic decisions. It supports the integration of the nation's near, mid, and long-term national security planning based on pragmatic internal U.S. and external to the world assessments and aspirational visions of what the future could be. Visionarios are developed in a continuous stream to study issues along an entire continuum of global and domestic topics of interest to the President. The center works in a project format to better define and understand organizations' complex problems and use systems-level tools to support high-level decision-making. We're demonstrating how the center can provide many different capabilities for the President, but ultimately, this center needs to move into the White House and the Executive Office of the President. The assessment capabilities are needed from deep space to cyberspace and everything in between. They're developed using the 5 essential planning perspectives of space, the planet, regions, countries, and the U.S. internal as well as cyberspace for each of the 3 time cycles of near, mid, and long term. And these assessments include both geographic and functional dimensions. The assessment of risk needs to encompass system risk most of the time. Frequently, the impact of a particular course of action has an economic or political risk associated with it, but risk in a world of complexity requires an understanding not only of individual risk variables, but of the interactions of risks associated with all of the system variables across the steep risk spectrum, from sociological, technological, economic, environmental, and political risk. Frequently, the risk needs to be accumulated, and the algorithms need to take into the consideration the amount of risk and the associated influence of multiple risk factors at the same time. And calculation is difficult. And of course, you can never account for all risk. Visioning and foresight produce both pragmatic and what-if scenarios to test assumptions, ends, ways, and means of plans. The center includes various inputs from the U.S. government, defense and intelligence communities, homeland security, private industry, academia, think tanks, and international entities as needed. Let me share some examples. Our partnership with Argonne is critical to the success of the center, and working with Pam Sidelko and her colleagues in the Systems Science Center in Argonne, we've developed an outstanding ability to work on serious global problems, especially with their agent-based models. We have other partnerships established as well, such as with the Aerospace Systems Design Laboratory at Georgia Institute of Technology, where we're beginning to work on other global systemic projects. We're working with the Universidad Rey Juan Carlos and their graduate program in intelligence. We're working with the government of Finland on a number of grand strategy projects with regard to economic development. Israel at 100, a Visionario in 2048, in which the complex issues surrounding the state of Israel were explored at the Galilee International Management Institute in Nahalal, Israel, was one of these projects. This Visionario was published, by the way, this year in the International Journal of Intelligence, Security, and Public Affairs in Spain, and a Putin-Trump Visionario will be published in this journal next year. Forging an American Grand Strategy, which was a symposium at the National Defense University, in which the need for strategic decision support tools and methodologies to develop foresight were discussed, especially at the level of the President. Energy Security is a Grand Strategy, a conference also at the National Defense University, which explored energy security as a wicked problem, needing complexity science algorithms to explore, and the extensive use of a Visionario, which was cited as the first reference in Plenty at Stake, Indicators of American Energy Insecurity, which was a Senate Energy White Paper written by U.S. Senators Lisa Murkowski and Tim Scott, and we were elated. Nanotechnology in 2050, a visionario in which the future of U.S. public policy on nanomanufacturing was explored for the Chief Scientist and Controller General of the General Accountability Office, the GAO, in Washington. It informed the final report to Congress and the subsequent hearings, which also made us very proud. A Chicago story, a visionario in which the Urban Security Project for the Chicago Roundtable on Counterviolence explored issues surrounding programs for youth for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The OEC Foresight Community, which is publishing many of our major success stories as we speak. The U.S. Army Strategic Studies Institute, where we've been involved in the use of foresight to study several different scenarios. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency's Foresight Initiative, which looked at the role of foresight methodologies in looking to the future. Working with Kat Tully of the School of International Futures in London, we've been exploring many different efforts as well. And finally, we've been privileged to work in partnership with Professor Leon Firth, Al Gore's National Security Advisor, who worked for him for 8 years in the White House. And he and I are joining forces as we work together toward a new future of anticipatory governance research and applications. Many new projects for 2017 are currently underway with partners both domestic and abroad, and other projects are being discussed as well. Lots of issues in many different areas of interest are being planned for the next year or two. We're delighted that so many projects are in our pipeline and with such distinguished partners. As a nation, the United States needs to become far more proactive in using foresight, analytical, and synthesis tools in shaping the future and working toward a world of increasing liberty, prosperity, justice, and peace, because that's the world future generations deserve. And we hope the Center is going to play a role in that future by informing the policy and strategy that emerges from the Executive Office of the President of the United States, no matter who the occupant of that office may be. So I want to thank you for your kind attention. I look forward to your questions, but first, let's take a look at the visionario Red Death. It's a 15-minute film developed by Argonne National Laboratory for me that many of us have been using to talk about the systemic disruptions of society and the risks involved.
This is an emergency alert system message. Continue watching for an...
Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has announced that a new viral outbreak has been detected in multiple cities across the country. The virus, which first surfaced last week, is listed as highly contagious.
When it first started, we thought it was just another flu surge.
The cities were hit the hardest. It was like wildfire. They were just consumed. Before we knew it, they were gone.
The death toll continues to rise in what some health officials are calling the worst pandemic since the deadly 1918 flu outbreak.
Humanity experiences a pandemic every 40 to 60 years. But this time we knew it was different. It was malicious. We'd never seen anything like it. It went straight for the central nervous system, and if it didn't kill you, it would paralyze you.
Today, alarm is growing that the global flu crisis may be out of control, with reports of hundreds of thousands of cases across Europe, South America, Russia, and even as far afield as Africa.
Nothing could have prepared us for what happened. Millions dead in a matter of weeks, billions across the globe. America was devastated. Nowhere was spared.
Many people in the Los Angeles area are defying orders to stay home and are spontaneously evacuating, causing massive traffic jams and preventing emergency vehicles from responding to calls.
It all happened so quickly. We tried to contain it with ring quarantines and curfews, but friends and family just compromised our plans and our controls. It was like a chain reaction.
My parents and my brother died of the flu. So did my aunts and my uncles and my grandparents. The social workers found a cousin who lived in Idaho, and I went to live with them.
The World Health Organization has confirmed that the recent pandemic has been upgraded to Phase 6, meaning that the recently emerged disease has spread to most regions across the globe.
We had a good, solid emergency plan. That's what we thought. We didn't anticipate this. This hit everywhere. It was all around us for months.
I remember the health department tried to get people to take precautions, like washing their hands, staying home.
Standard antivirals didn't work against this. Nothing worked against this.
We did everything the health department asked us to. We shut the schools, canceled events, urged people to stay at home. Nothing seemed to work.
People started wearing masks. Dust masks or handkerchiefs tied around their faces or even respirators, but none of these could ever do any good.
We started running low on masks and gloves. I even heard that some of the masks and medical shipments were being stolen.
Everywhere we went, we saw people wearing paper masks. My mom made us wear cloth masks around our faces every time we went to the store.
We were completely overwhelmed. There were just so many people coming into the hospital. People were lined up outside the hospital just trying to get in. Then security put us on lockdown. They closed the hospital to new patients. I thought there was going to be a riot out there.
As government officials were forced to admit global efforts to control the pandemic are unsuccessful, hospitals in several major cities in the U.S. have reported an unprecedented surge in new cases.
We heard officials on the news say that they were going to be able to contain the outbreak. I knew it wasn't true.
We declared a state of emergency. Most of our staff were out sick, or they just didn't show up.
We tried to get the local churches to cancel services because people were coming together and spreading the disease. Some closed their doors, some didn't.
We were low on staff. They were either sick or trying to be with their own families.
We lost so many good people. We tried. I'm sorry.
China has closed its borders as a result of the spreading global pandemic. Officials in Beijing have yet to release any information of the number of people affected by the deadly virus.
One of the symptoms was the formation of large red blisters on the skin and the coughing of blood. That's why the media started calling it the Red Death.
Somebody at the health department finally came up with the idea of setting up a treatment center at the local train station. I guess it was better than nothing. We just didn't have the supplies to treat so many patients.
The U.S. Department of Homeland Security has confirmed that the Red Death pandemic that has swept the globe was artificially produced and most likely the work of an undetermined terrorist group.
It took us, working with a team from Fort Detrick, about 2 months to determine that the pathogen was artificial and had been released in what was then the last United Nations General Assembly. From then, it went out to every center of government across the globe.
We've just learned that the president and remaining cabinet members have been evacuated to an undisclosed location. Government operations in Washington, D.C. have come to a virtual standstill as workers are either sick or just not reporting for work.
World financial markets took another dive today, and some experts are predicting a complete collapse in the wake of the Red Death global pandemic.
I remember my dad went to the ATM to get some money, but it didn't work. He got real mad and kind of scared too.
We heard the big cities were hit the hardest. Food ran out real fast. Water was real low. People from the cities came to the countryside. We didn't know where to put them all.
The stores ran out of stuff right away. Food, water, all kinds of supplies.
Gasoline is beginning to be in short supply as ports are closed and ships are turned away. Federal officials are vowing to tap into these strategic petroleum reserves, but say fuel rationing may be necessary.
The city was in chaos. Food riots were breaking out. Someone even tried to rob the hospital at gunpoint for food and medical supplies.
With no trucks running, there were no deliveries of anything. There were no delivery of food, no clothes, no gasoline.
My brother had a video camera. He would tape what food supplies we had. He called it our pandemic supplies. He got sick and died a little while later.
And the farm fields. No power to run the irrigation system. No fuel for the machines to harvest anything that was left in the fields. And most important, no people.
Feeding people who survived the first wave became a problem. We didn't have food to feed these people. What were we to do?
6 of the top 10 insurance companies filed for bankruptcy this week, claiming that they could never pay the volume of insurance claims being submitted across the globe.
So many people died. There were just so many bodies. We didn't know what to do with all the bodies.
So many people died. We just didn't have a way to bury them all.
I remember looking out the window and seeing our neighbor, Mr. Jacobson, burying his wife in the yard.
I mean, we had plans for a mass fatality event, but never imagined something like this.
We started storing the bodies at the local ice rink. It worked out fine. And then the power went out.
We finally made the hard decisions about what to do.
With all the casualties, governments, utilities, media, the National Guard just collapsed.
Some of the smaller towns decided to isolate themselves. They set up roadblocks. They hoarded food. They wouldn't let anybody in.
The public works guys told me the power plants had lost so many people to the Red Death, they couldn't keep the plants operating. When the lights went out, that's when things really got crazy.
Then one day, I turned the faucet on and no water came out.
We'd lost so many people, we couldn't keep the water treatment plants running.
That's when the first cases of cholera started showing up.
First, my brother died. Then my dad died. And then my mom died. I didn't really know what to do, so I stayed in the house until some men in plastic suits showed up and pounded on the door.
After all this time on our own, the feds suddenly appear and want my assets so they can redistribute them for the greater good. No, not while I still have people that have needs.
The town where my cousin lived got really religious. It was all run by some local preacher. You had to go to church every morning before you all ate in a big room. If you didn't go to church, you went hungry.
The virus finally burned itself out. But by then, we had other problems.
Fighting continues across much of Sudan and destabilized Central Africa, where ethnic cleansing continues in the wake of the Red Death plague. And North Korea has continued to take advantage of the global pandemic by building up troops and arms along the border with South Korea.
In the urban areas, gangs adapted. One day, they were sitting on a corner selling drugs. The next, they were in warehouses, the nearest industrial parks, selling gasoline, insulin, food, water, security, you name it.
When the last outbreak was finally over, we were in pretty bad shape.
In a rare news conference today, the World Health Organization stated that the global pandemic death toll was estimated to be approximately 1.6 billion people, with an additional 1 billion permanently incapacitated by the deadly disease.
My son and 2 grandchildren died.
I lost my entire family.
I lost 2 brothers, a niece, and my favorite nephew.
My wife died. My sister died. My son died. I just don't understand why we weren't better prepared for something like this.
Of course, a big part of the reason for the development of the film was to demonstrate the systemic elements of societal infrastructure in a modern society, and to really explore unintended consequences and things that we don't always consider because we tend to truly...
This is an emergency alert system message.
How do I stop
Continue
this?
watching for
Okay. The issues are really about in a modern society where everything is connected to everything else, how do you really stop one thing from happening when the cascading effects go out of control? And breaking the systems of society enable you to explore some very deep-seated ideas that people have in terms of their assumptions about what is and is not possible. And it has been very successful in helping us to actually engage with many black elephant issues because people won't talk about it. But when you show them a story, it is much easier for them to talk about it. And with that, I want to thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Sheila. So, questions?
Sheila, thank you very much for the, excellent presentation. My question here is that, you didn't explain the importance, the warranty of contingency preparation, because you know why you have plan A, B, C, A to Z on contingency. But I notice in America, contingency is a big, big problem. Katrina, for example, you can see that. Very, very obvious. Secondly, is that why exclusive to those, think tanks? Why is it you're not prescribing the possibilities of open innovation with others that know specific contribution that they can do it? Why is it so? Why so limited yourself with a kind of, unthinkable, challenges? And are you looking at a possibility of, unbox those, potentialities that you can discover new, highly, highly, highly important matter that I think that America is not doing. And when your incoming president is working on Twitter too much often, then how are you going to be to overcome that? What kind of White House are we going to expect?
For some reason, I knew I would be asked a question about the incoming administration. I think that, well, first of all, I think that the issue of bringing in perspectives from, innovative ideas is important to have collaborative partnerships all over the world. I certainly am creating those. But we did during the project on national security reform as well. I mean, we had input from almost every ally around the world. So this was not done in isolation. All of the work of the Project on National Security Reform had input from our friends and allies around the world. It was not only an American project. In terms of insulating, let me say a couple things that I think may be useful to understand. The Project on National Security Reform, I think, documented fairly well, the broader study documented that the executive office of the President of the United States is perhaps one of the more dysfunctional functions of government. It is a tiny, tiny group of people. We're talking about, just a few hundred people here. And that's the White House staff. That includes the National Security Council staff. I mean, it is limited by law so that you can't have lots of people in it to do some of the most important work that the US government does. So to be functional, we made a lot of recommendations on changes to the executive office of the presidency. Congress has to be a part of this discussion. This isn't something that the president decides because the president doesn't fund his office. Congress funds his office. And this is something that is not really, I think, well understood, even by Americans. And that is, we tend to ascribe to our presidents credit or blame for everything that goes on in the world because we think they have the power to do something about it. And the reality is they don't. There are limits to what they can do. The downside of that is that frequently, we think the president can do this or can do that. Of course, he's president. Not true. Not in the United States. The upside of that is that our incoming president does not have the power he thinks he has. Now, this is on the record, isn't it? But that is true for any president. Presidents are human beings and they make mistakes. I mean, that's just reality. And the checks and balances system in the United States is incredibly powerful. And so there are limits to everyone's power, including the president's. I do not know what the next 4 years will bring. I have relocated to Virginia. I have left my home in Michigan, even though I'm still working in Michigan. I don't know what kind of positions I'm going to take. I'm pretty sure I will not be serving in the Trump administration in any capacity. That's not in the cards, but that doesn't mean I can't serve my country and help support the continued work of my center, whether it's with the US Department of Defense, the US Department of Energy, which obviously I'm currently being funded from, defense as well, intelligence as well. There are a lot of civil servants in the US government who really support this work and want to see it eventually. I don't even know if the center will exist in the White House in my lifetime, but it doesn't mean that I can't spend the next 10 to 15 years trying very hard to make that case strongly. I just know I can't do it from Michigan. I have to do it from the Washington, D.C. area. I don't know if it answered all your questions, but it may have touched on most of them.
Do you think that the future, because Trump is a businessman, will he forego the American midnight hour amendment, which I think Barack would have put in a lot, just like George Bush is putting in, and Barack cannot take it off, even after 2 terms. Guantanamo Bay, for example, is one factor.
I cannot answer that.
After that talk, surely there are some more questions. Actually, the film depressed us so much, you see, it quieted
Well,
everybody down.
I have to say, I am an optimist. And I think the reason I'm an optimist is that films like this, although very powerful and although very depressing, really help people understand that, number one, we're looking at things like this to determine how to ensure they do not happen. That is the legacy of Herman Kahn. If you can see a future you don't like, you have it within your power to do something about it. You may think as an individual you're powerless, but you know, one person can make a difference. And it's people like the people in this room who are going to make that difference for the future of the world. That's why it's so important for us to believe that, because we can.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. One of the problems, though, in national security, or as you presented it, is that sharing this scenario with your allies is relatively easy, but the challenge is how do you share it with your enemies? Because something like mutual assured destruction required both sides in the Cold War to appreciate it.
Correct.
Because if the Kremlin had decided they could win a first strike, then the whole thing, of course, unraveled. So how does this work in sharing scenarios more generally? I mean, difficult perhaps with Pyongyang, but you know, with other potential.
That's an excellent question. I think probably, you know, at least it's been my observation that because much of the work, for example, of the Project on National Security Reform was public. So, for example, the 2010 report to the Congress that includes the 9 scenarios that I described to you is all in the public domain. Anyone can get it off of the website. And I am very, I have data to suggest that that document in particular was well read all over the world by both friends and enemies. And the United States has many enemies, there's no question. And we may have fewer enemies than we have competitors. But I think it's important for everyone to know that the United States is really trying very hard, whether our current administration doesn't see it yet or not, or the incoming administration doesn't see it yet or not. There are a lot of people who are working on this process, and they span the entire US government. And that's an important thing to me.
One of the problems with systems thinking is that it's usually operated within closed epistemic groups who talk a particular kind of language. So we involve ourselves in this kind of work in blowback and stuff like that. Can you give us evidence that there are critical anthropologists, critical theorists, serious critical theorists involved in this kind of work that you're involved in? Can I just attach one additional thing to it? I mean, it seems to me your presentation and indeed the movie show a particular kind of first world bias to global problems. Because the references to Africa were very disparaging. And I even think that there were racial dimensions in the kind of pictures you were presenting. So I'm not asking you to comment on the second part, I'm interested in the first part.
I don't know how to answer the second part anyway. This was written by a group of Americans, so you know, I will take whatever responsibility for the scenario the way it played out. The actual film was made by a group of amateurs, and I think they did a pretty good job of exploring systemic relationships, which was really the aim of the film. And I'm sure that there was no racial bias intended. Nevertheless, to answer your first question, I think the answer is I do not know of cultural anthropologists, though we had one in our national academies sample who put together some fascinating thoughts that were incorporated into many of the visionarios. But I don't know too many who really have been studying this issue. We did a literature review, but I don't think that we had that many people outside of Oxford, and mainly future studies people who were doing work in the area, not across the social sciences. And I think part of that is the social sciences don't view this as a legitimate area of inquiry or research. And in my department, because I'm not publishing in, the Academy of Management journals and, the very narrow journal populations, a lot of people look at me and say, well, she's just a practitioner. And and I have chosen to do that, but I'm a full professor now, and I can do what I want to do. And I think this is important work. But I think that I'm finding increasingly my colleagues at places like the Academy of Management are learning more and more about less and less, and they're just not as relevant. Their research isn't as relevant to my needs as I try and work with the policy community, because they're not interdisciplinary in their scope and in their thinking. Now, there are more systems science, social systems science programs that are emerging around the world, and I think that in 20 years from now, that problem may disappear. But I think it's taken a long time for that to emerge, unfortunately.
First, I'd like to thank you for your very interesting lecture. So I'd like to add something, I think, a little bit more positive note to the depression, so-called, that we have just witnessed on the fictional film. Actually, this ties back with the session a little earlier, is that security people around the world, US, of course, and Singapore included, is actually emphasizing on security on SCADA. For those who do not know this acronym, SCADA stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. So the primary aim of SCADA is actually preventing threats that goes in all the hardware of our essential living vehicles, such as electricity, water, and mode of transport, etc. Because all these hardware are now controlled by either microcontroller and chips everywhere in every devices. And why is this so important? Because more and more hacking is actually going into this, so that your critical livelihood, when it's cut, that's the end of you. And this brings back to one thing that you have shown in the film, which is about biological hacking. Because biological hacking, a pandemic or whatever you call it, can be activated via any of these vehicles, such as water is a critical means of living. So I will not elaborate any further. If you are interested in this subject, Google is there. Thank you.
Yes, I'm rather familiar with SCADA systems and what they do to protect critical infrastructure. Nevertheless, I think there are still lots of vulnerabilities that we need to be mindful of. I think part of the problems that at least we face in the West, and the Americans are probably the most guilty, is we take infrastructure for granted. We just think it's going to be there, it's somebody else's problem, and to me that's very dangerous. So I think it's important to be mindful.
Sheila, thank you. Could I follow on that point? This is going to sound like an advert for you employing archaeologists, but it isn't really meant that way. First, in terms of people from social fields, it would be worth looking at the archaeological community, because we have a strange habit. We have to collaborate with people. We have to recognize that most of the specialists we deal with know more than we do about the stuff we're working on. And it means that there is an interconnected collaboration and a cross-disciplinary adherence in archaeology, along with a long time depth, that would perhaps be useful in this context. Beyond that, I particularly wanted to follow on your point about infrastructure, because on the end of that film was another long story, which is that when infrastructure has gone down, getting it back up is very difficult. And once it has gone, it causes a cascade of further problems. If your population's gone down, you don't have the personnel or the expertise to bring it back up. And I wanted to introduce a much broader proposition. You had said earlier that a nation has to know its competitors. The competitors are usually spoken of as if they are other nations or other people with purpose and intent. But in the world we now live in, our competitors are also climate, disease, for instance, and they are actors in their own right. And on top of that, and this is the thing that interests me because it's my own field of research, is that the material, the stuff we have made, is an independent variable having impacts in its own right. And that is interacting with society and culture. And it's that interaction which is one of the critical problems that we're going to face as these systems begin to fracture.
I agree.
I thank you for a great presentation. And I think it showed, interestingly, how we can use kind of the imagining of dystopia to start thinking about possible futures. I was wondering if you could comment on your thoughts on how science fiction can extend that by translating those ideas to the public, and whether or not you have specific examples of that kind of working to help the public and society really address a lot of these issues.
Well, yes. One of the projects that we are hoping to get funded is through the Redford Foundation, which actually awards young filmmakers opportunities to create films that make a positive impact and have something important to say. I think that we in my little center are going to be looking to at least the artistic community to help us along the way as we begin to populate the spectrum of visionarios that we're preparing. I should also say that if you are able to download from my website the 2010 scenarios report, you will find that all of the 9 scenarios have if we make the changes that we're recommending, this is the positive outcome from all 9 scenarios. So there's a, if you don't make the changes, this is what you get. But if you do make the changes, the scenarios improve tremendously. And I think that helps. Now, that doesn't directly relate to your science fiction question, but we had several artists who participated. Of the 133, I think we had 7 artists, and 2 of them were science fiction writers. So it was kind of cool to watch what they gave us, which was actually quite different than what we got from some musicians. And but nevertheless, it was a very interesting intellectual experience. But it also led us to seek out Hollywood's assistance, because we think that the ability to put some of these stories into film form is powerful as a learning tool in and of itself.
Hi, hello. I want to ask a very specific scenario about overpopulation, because if we are continuing to progress, continuing to use up the Earth resources, which are highly limited, one day we will come to an end. And do you think this kind of disease may actually be an opportunity for the human race? Because as we can see in some science fictions like Dan Brown's Inferno, some people actually invented this kind of disease, claiming that it will actually protect the existence of human race. So have you thought about overpopulation, and how do we deal with this? Thank you.
I think the answer to that is yes. I have thought about overpopulation. It was not directly one of the visionarios that we chose, but the Earth is a finite entity, and I don't know what the carrying capacity of the Earth is. I will say that there are far more humane ways to deal with population control, like educating women and emancipating them around the world, that will in fact help with the overpopulation issue, that are much better. Because honestly, I think nature has its own Gaia, life, and life force, and it is possible that natural disease can just overtake us if we do not have the ability, especially for the poorer people on the planet, to defend themselves against disease. And they may just get, whole groups could get wiped out. We created this pathogen to make it more complex, because that's, of course, part of what we were trying to study. But it's very frightening to me to understand nature a little bit and realize that there are natural ways that this kind of thing could occur. But there are better ways to go about that issue.
As an expert and an outsider, what is your advice for Singapore?
I love Singapore. Peter Ho was my sponsor for the Fulbright, and I have learned so much from Singapore. And I'm very grateful to the people of Singapore who have been so generous to helping me, to helping my projects over the years. I think Singapore is doing a lot of the right things. And the most important thing that Singapore needs to do is continue to be the learning entity that it is, because I think it's a protection. Because the more you know, the more the future belongs to people who are learning. That's what I think.
So, you appreciated that answer, but again, can I ask you to give your appreciation to Sheila for that excellent presentation.